One quiet morning on his lonely ranch, he thought life would never surprise him again. But hidden in the forest, two small, frightened children, lost, hungry, and running from a past that had scarred them, changed everything in an instant. What began as a simple act of rescue would test his courage, challenge the whispers of a suspicious town, and slowly, painfully, transform their lives forever. Watch as a solitary man becomes more than a caretaker, and two children discover the meaning of home, trust, and family. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love these stories, make sure to subscribe before diving in. Now, let's begin. The dawn broke with a stubborn gray light that refused to touch the horizon. The air in the valley felt like it had been held back overnight, thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint tang of burned wood from some distant campfire. I walked the fence line that morning, the boards rough against my palms, my boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. The land stretched wide, open as far as the eye could see, and yet that vastness made it feel smaller somehow, as if secrets hid in every swath of shadowed grass. My hands lingered on the posts longer than needed, tracing the knots in the wood, the scars carved by years of wind and rain. There was a rhythm to it, the slow pressing of one foot after the other, the steady march of a man who had long ago learned to measure the hours not by clocks but by the land itself. The birds hadn't begun their morning chorus yet, and the only sound was the faint creak of the fence in the breeze, a small whisper of motion in a world that had not yet fully awakened. Then I heard it, so soft it could have been the wind brushing across the grass, or the echo of some old memory. A tiny sound, too small for these plains to carry, a trembling breath hidden in the hollow of the forest that bordered my land. I stopped, ears straining, heart settling into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the cry of an animal. Not this time. I followed the sound, slow, careful, boots pressing into the soil without disturbing more than the dust at my heels. The trees rose like sentinels, the air cooler beneath their shadow. A hollow log lay at the edge of a small clearing, moss clinging to its rotted surface, dark inside as though the night had refused to leave. The sound came from there. Whimpers, thin and brittle, shaking with fear. I crouched low, letting my bulk shrink into the shadows, and peered inside. Two faces, pale and streaked with dirt, pressed close together. Eyes too wide, too cautious, glimmered in the dim light. Their hair matted with rain and leaves, dresses torn and muddied, they looked as fragile as sparrows caught in a storm. My stomach knotted, and I felt a hollow ache echo through me. Hunger and fear had once made those same sounds escape my own throat, long ago, in corners I'd thought nobody watched. I didn't move closer at first. I let the silence stretch between us, a tense balance, and breathed in the damp air, tasting memory as much as fear. Their whimpers continued, small and hesitant, until one voice, barely above the rustling of leaves, whispered, "Please, don't hurt us." The words hit me harder than a rifle's report. I felt something inside me shift, the weight of my own past pressing against the present. I remembered belts, the sting of ropes, the copper tang of blood when punishment had been handed out for nothing more than being small, defenseless, alive. I swallowed hard, letting my throat settle, and reached slowly, palm open, offering not command, but choice. The smaller of the two reached out, trembling, tiny fingers brushing against my calloused hand. I did not close my hand around hers. I simply lifted, careful, as if holding water in a cracked jar. The other followed, hesitant, grasping the fabric of my shirt. I lifted them both, their bodies light, yet carrying the weight of all they had endured. Behind them, the log remained hollow, but it no longer carried fear, it carried a promise of refuge. The walk home was slow. My cabin rose from the valley, humble and patched, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. The children pressed close, eyes wide, breaths shallow, yet steadying themselves against the rhythm of my steps. Inside, I set them near the warmth of the fire, filling a tin cup with water, breaking bread into small pieces. They ate quickly, hunger driving them, yet I let them be, knowing well how lessons of survival were taught best by the body's need. Evening came heavy with shadows, and the children curled near the hearth under blankets I had laid out. I watched them, a mountain of a man in a small room, heart taut, mind restless. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin, carrying the faint sounds of a world that had not yet forgiven. I could walk away, leave them to some other fate, safe from gossip, from trouble. But as one small hand slipped free of the blanket, curling around my boot in search of something solid, I froze. The choice was made for me. I would keep them. I would shelter them. And in that quiet cabin, surrounded by the echo of their small, trusting breaths, I understood what it meant to bear responsibility. To be more than a man who tilled land, who raised fences, who endured solitude. To be the kind of man who could offer safety in a world that often offered none. The night stretched long, silent, except for the faint crackle of embers in the hearth and the slow, steady breathing of two children who had found, if only for a moment, a place where fear could rest. Outside, shadows deepened in the valley, and the wind carried a faint promise, whispering of trials yet to come, of a past that would not remain silent. But for now, within the walls of a weathered cabin, there was warmth, quiet, and fragile beginnings of trust. The sun rose higher over the valley, burning through the morning mist and scattering its fragile threads across the fence posts. The children had stirred, but their movements were careful, tentative, as though even waking was a risk. Their small faces, streaked with dirt from last night's flight, peeked from beneath the blankets, eyes darting toward me when I moved about the cabin. I felt their gaze, not accusatory, but measuring. They were weighing me, the only person in a world that had proven dangerous at every turn. I moved quietly to the hearth, raking the embers into a shallow warmth. The wood crackled faintly, a low hum that filled the space, steady as a heartbeat. I placed another tin cup of water and some bread before them, watching closely as their tiny fingers wrapped around the pieces with the same urgency they had shown yesterday. Hunger had taught them fast, but trust was slower. I didn't speak much. Words were too fragile for the weight of what had brought them here. My voice had never been a tool I wielded lightly. Actions had always spoken louder than sentences. I fetched buckets of water from the creek, letting the rhythm of the task dictate the morning. Each time the girls' wide eyes followed me, I felt the responsibility tighten around my chest. Their fear was tangible, but so was their curiosity. By midday, the sunlight had grown harsh, gold bleeding across the valley like liquid fire. The wind carried scents of sage and earth, the faint traces of smoke from distant cabins in the hills. I led the children outside, their bare feet patting softly against the worn boards of the porch. I showed them the corral, my old gray horse standing patiently as I stroked its neck. One girl pressed herself against the other, hesitant. The animal towered over them, but its calm eyes offered a quiet assurance. Slowly, trembling, one small hand reached out. The brush of her fingers against the coarse hair made her gasp, a sharp, delighted sound that startled the other into laughter. The sound was so fragile, so thin, that it might have broken if I had moved too quickly. By the time we returned inside, I felt a subtle shift. Fear was still present, yes, but mingled now with a tentative sense of safety. They were learning, slowly, that here, no one would reach for a belt, no shadow in the room would seek to harm. But the world beyond the cabin had its own concerns. The townsfolk had noticed movement on the valley road the previous day, the odd sight of a giant man carrying two small children along a path no one frequented. By noon, whispers had begun to crawl through the streets like vines. Who are they? Where do they belong? Why are they with him? I heard the murmurs even before I saw the first pointed fingers. A woman leaned against a post near the general store, eyes sharp, her voice as thin and sharp as broken glass. "They're with him?" she asked, almost rhetorically, as if the question itself carried the weight of accusation. Men nodded, murmuring about bloodlines, about law, about propriety. I did not answer. I never had. Silence had always been my strongest shield, and I trusted it more than I trusted words. The children felt the tension, their small bodies pressing closer together when we walked along the road. One would glance up at me, eyes wide, and I would nod, a silent assurance that the world's judgment mattered little within the valley's boundary. Their trust, fragile and uneven, grew in the spaces between whispers, in the hours spent sweeping hearths and scattering grain for the hens. Yet the peace was deceptive. Evening fell, and with it came shadows that seemed longer, heavier than any I had seen before. I stacked wood along the cabin's wall, each piece a small act of preparation against a night that always seemed capable of more than darkness. The children watched, small and tense, but I noticed subtle shifts, the way one reached out to touch the freshly stacked logs, the other brushing her hair from her eyes without fear of reprimand. These were minor victories, almost invisible, but they were proof that trust was beginning to root itself. By the second night, I had begun to hear the first real stirrings of concern from the town. A man rode past, tipping his hat in mock civility, eyes assessing, lips curled in judgment. Children clung to each other as if instinct had become a living thing, wrapping itself around their small shoulders to protect them from the invisible threat. And the whispers carried heavier, sharper. Blood is thicker, a stranger cannot care for them, why not return them to their rightful place? I did not answer these questions. My back ached from work, my hands bore cuts and bruises, but I did not let the weight of the town's suspicion alter my actions. I fed the girls, let them drink, prepared beds, and tended to the cabin. Every gesture was deliberate, every movement measured. I became a wall, and within that wall, the children learned something I had never thought I could teach. The quiet strength of safety, the unspoken reassurance that no one would reach for them with cruelty again. Time moved in small increments, measured in sips of water, bites of bread, and the slow, careful chopping of wood. Shadows lengthened across the valley, but the cabin glowed with the warmth of firelight, holding a fragile peace in its timbers. Yet even as the girls curled under blankets, murmuring softly to each other in a language of fear and hope, the world beyond our walls had not forgotten them. The wind carried whispers from the town, from the men and women who could not see what I saw in their eyes. Children learning to trust, to feel protected, to begin believing that perhaps the world could offer more than cruelty. As midnight approached, I moved to the door, hand resting on the latch. Outside, the wind carried the faint crunch of hooves, distant but deliberate. I felt the familiar pull of vigilance tighten in my chest, the echo of a past I had thought buried in years of solitude. Sleep did not come easily that night, nor would it for many nights after. The valley was still, the forest near the cabin dark and unyielding, but I knew in my bones that the past had not forgotten them, nor had it forgiven the world that left them unguarded for so long. And still, as the fire crackled and the children's breathing slowed, I held firm to one truth: within these walls, they would not face harm. Outside, the world might judge, might threaten, might whisper of claims and bloodlines, but within, there was shelter, there was warmth, and there was the slow, steady promise of trust beginning to grow. By the time dawn approached, gray and thin as smoke across the valley, I had resolved that no matter what came, the children would not be taken back into a past that had scarred them. I would endure the town's suspicion, endure the weight of solitude again, and endure the whispers. But I would not let them fall. Not again. Not ever. I returned to the children as first light seeped through the shutters. Their eyes opened slowly, cautious, hesitant, but not with the immediate terror of the day before. A small victory. I placed bread and water before them, letting them eat at their own pace, letting them make small choices that slowly stitched the fabric of trust between us. And as I watched, I realized that this house, this patch of land in the valley, would soon become more than a refuge. It would become a home, a place where the children could learn that safety could exist, that someone could stand between them and harm, that love could be offered quietly, without demand, without expectation. Outside, the valley held its secrets tight, the wind carrying both hope and threat in equal measure. But inside, the cabin breathed warmth, a fragile hearth around which two small bodies began to unravel the tight coils of fear. And I, a man who had long believed in solitude and silence, had begun to learn the weight, the honor, and the quiet terror of responsibility. The valley had shifted since the morning I had found them. The sun rode higher now, burning through the mist and lighting the dry grass in streaks of gold, but the cabin remained a small, quiet island of warmth against a tide of scrutiny. The children moved with more confidence, though each creak of the boards beneath their feet reminded them, and me, of the fragility of trust. They had begun to understand the rhythm of safety, of water fetched and bread broken and fires stoked, yet the outside world refused to leave them be. By mid-morning, the first real signs of the town's suspicion pressed against the edges of our valley. A rider passed by on the dirt road, tipping his hat with eyes that weighed too much and words that carried even heavier assumptions. He lingered longer than necessary, speaking to no one, but the murmur of his passage left a ripple through the town that reached our ears like an unwanted wind. Soon, whispers became words. Neighbors spoke in corners, at the market, over fences where their hands rested like claws ready to pry. "They're with him now," a woman hissed, leaning over the edge of a wooden railing. Her voice carried like a shard of ice, sharp and thin. "Two children, alone, with a man that size. No kin. No wife. Doesn't seem right, does it?" The murmurs grew like wildfire in dry grass. I kept to my tasks, sweeping the hearth, tending the fire, stacking wood. I said nothing. Words, when hurled by strangers, were rarely neutral. They carried judgment that could burn a house down without a single spark. I had learned that long ago. My silence was both shield and sword. The children felt the tension before they saw its source. Their small hands gripped each other as we walked outside, the boards of the porch creaking under weight too heavy for their minds to measure. I moved between them and the world, a living wall, careful not to frighten, careful not to break the fragile courage they had begun to muster. By afternoon, I had noticed changes in their behavior. One would glance over her shoulder when a shadow moved near the window. The other hugged herself when a bird stirred too loudly in the corral. The fear of the past was still alive in them, a ghost I could neither chase nor speak away. So I let my actions speak. I led them to the horse, letting them touch the warm muzzle and feel the slow breathing beneath a coat rough with age. The animal was a teacher as much as I was, a living example of calm and patience. It was in the quiet of that afternoon that I first saw the stranger. He came like a shadow at the edge of the forest, lean and silent, his eyes sharp and scanning. I did not recognize him yet, but the weight in his stance, the way the sunlight struck the contours of his face, told me that this was no ordinary passerby. Something in him held ownership, or the twisted sense of it, and the children sensed it immediately. One trembled, pressing her small body into the other, whispering nothing, just clinging. The forest seemed to hold its breath with us. I did not speak. I did not move toward him. My hands hovered near the edge of the corral, near the horse, near anything that could serve as a shield. And yet, I was certain in my bones that this man was part of the past that had chased them. Not yesterday, but years ago, shadowed, cruel, a figure whose presence alone could unravel what little safety we had carved. The stranger lingered at the forest line, watching, assessing, calculating. He did not approach directly, but his eyes followed every motion we made, tracing the children's small movements with a precision born of familiarity and intent. He seemed to know the contours of fear, the way it bent around bodies, the way it curled in the spaces between trust. That night, I prepared for the possibility he would not leave. I stacked extra wood along the hearth, secured the doors and windows, and made certain the children were near the warmth of the fire, blankets drawn tightly around them. Their faces were pale, but they clung to each other with a shared courage, fragile as glass but real. I poured water into cups and set bread near them, letting them eat without hurry, without instruction. Small routines, but in them lay the first seeds of resilience. The valley fell into silence as the stars claimed the sky. Yet even in the quiet, I felt the weight pressing against the cabin from beyond, the invisible eyes that had marked us in the afternoon. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I moved from window to window, listening for the scrape of a boot on stone, the faint stir of a branch against the wind. The children, curled together, seemed to sense the vigilance I offered. One pressed her small hand into mine, seeking anchor, and I held it steady, as though I could transfer my certainty through skin. Days passed, each measured in the rhythm of chores and small lessons. I taught them how to fetch water, how to feed the chickens, how to clean the hearth without startling the embers. In these acts, they began to understand safety, a language spoken without words but heavy with meaning. Their laughter returned in fragments, tiny sparks in the dim world we carved, brief moments of light that reminded me why the world beyond could wait. But the whispers of the town did not pause, and the shadow of the stranger grew longer. I saw him more clearly as the days moved forward, sometimes in the distance, sometimes nearer than the horizon suggested. Each time, the children flinched, the fragile trust they had begun to weave trembling under the weight of old terror. I could not chase him yet, could not confront him directly without risking more than I was ready to protect. Instead, I became a wall between him and the children. I learned the art of presence, of being larger than fear, slower than panic, steadier than doubt. I carried them when the path was rough, letting the weight of my body remind them they could rely on something solid. I tended the cabin, fortified our routines, and ensured that every corner was a place of safety, every ember a reminder that warmth still existed. The town continued to watch, gossip threading through their words like barbed wire. They saw only a man and 2 children, no family ties, no apparent reason for the bond. And yet, what they could not see was the depth of the trust forming in quiet corners, in moments of stillness, in bread broken and water poured, in hands held and hearts cautiously opening. I knew the stranger would not wait forever. The forest had eyes, the wind carried whispers, and I felt the inevitability pressing against us. But in that inevitability, I also found clarity. I had chosen this path. I had chosen to be the anchor in a world that had been cruel to them, the steady presence that would not flinch, would not falter, would not allow them to be taken back into shadows. The first real confrontation had not yet arrived, but its shape hung over the valley like a storm cloud, silent yet potent, promising upheaval. And I, a man long accustomed to solitude, understood that soon, all choices would matter, every movement would weigh, every decision would carry consequence. I returned to the hearth that night, sitting between the children, letting the firelight play across their small faces. I could feel the tension in their bodies, but I could also feel their budding courage, the faint pulse of trust that had begun to root itself in the soil of this cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying fragments of shadows and rumors, but inside, we had begun to build something that could not be claimed by whispers alone, a fragile, enduring sanctuary. And so, we waited. For the shadow to approach, for the world beyond the valley to make its demands, for the first true test of trust and protection. I did not know what form it would take, nor did I know if the children were ready. But I knew that I would meet it, not with words, not with argument, but with the slow, deliberate force of someone unwilling to allow harm to touch those who had nowhere else to turn. The morning air hung heavy with tension, the kind that presses into the lungs and makes every breath measured. The children stirred quietly, sensing it before I even did. There was a subtle shift in the wind, a disturbance in the usual rhythm of the forest, and I knew before opening the cabin door that he had come closer. The man from their past, lean and merciless, had moved from shadow to presence, and the valley felt smaller, tighter, as if the trees themselves leaned in to watch the unfolding storm. I stepped outside, the boards of the porch creaking beneath my boots, each sound deliberate, grounding, meant to communicate control. The children followed, small and cautious, their fingers curling around the edges of blankets and my coat as if testing the solidity of the world around them. The horse shifted in its stall, sensing the change, ears pricked forward, and I let the animal's stillness reassure me. From the tree line, I caught the glint of sunlight on metal, the hint of a belt buckle, the outline of a gun, the unmistakable posture of someone who intended to reclaim what he believed belonged to him. He did not call, did not shout. He merely watched, calculating, waiting for the moment he thought fear would give him advantage. I, too, measured the distance between us, calculating every step, every potential path of confrontation, every possibility of keeping the children safe. The children pressed against each other, whispering nothing, eyes wide and unblinking. They had begun to understand the language of fear, learned in the hard classrooms of the past. And it was a language I could not erase with words alone. Only actions, deliberate and steady, could teach them safety, and I became the living lesson. I crouched, bringing my height closer to theirs, allowing my presence to speak louder than any admonition or reassurance. I began fortifying the cabin subtly. I checked locks, placed logs near the windows to prevent entry, and moved the heavier furniture to block paths. The children watched, learning, absorbing the way preparation itself could act as a shield. In their wide eyes, I saw the flicker of understanding. Protection was a thing built, not spoken into existence. By afternoon, The stranger had moved from observation to encroachment. His figure appeared closer, the glint of steel catching sun through the branches, deliberate and threatening. The valley echoed with the soft crunch of his boots on dry leaves, and I knew this was the first act in a sequence of calculated intimidation. My mind worked through scenarios, every step precise, as I prepared to shield the children from harm. I led them to the corral, letting the horse become a buffer between us. Their small hands gripped the reins cautiously, learning courage in fragments. I demonstrated how to stand firm without panicking, how to anchor oneself with the rhythm of breath and the weight of presence. They mirrored me subtly, and I saw the first sparks of resilience. Meanwhile, the town's whispers had grown into spoken words. Men and women paused mid-task, leaning on fences or walls, mouths twitching with curiosity and judgment. Children's safety, or so they claimed, became a spectacle, and I felt the eyes pressing through the woods, imagining threats where I only saw necessity. A woman with sharp lips called across the road, her voice sweetened with suspicion. "A man alone with 2 children? Best make sure nothing happens to them, or you will answer to all of us." I did not respond. I did not acknowledge the words, but I filed them away, knowing that the weight of gossip could influence even those who meant well. By nightfall, the stranger had made his presence undeniable. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, closer than ever, watching, waiting, and daring me to step beyond the bounds of control. I had learned the lessons of the wild, the calculus of patience and timing, and I waited with him, letting the stillness communicate as much as any shout could. The children crouched low near the hearth, shadows of themselves, yet with me between them and danger, and the firelight danced across our faces, a small island of warmth against the encroaching darkness. I moved carefully, fetching water and bread, placing the small tin cups and broken slices near the children without alarm. The act itself was defiance, a claim of normalcy against the tension pressing down from outside. They ate in fragments, cautious yet aware that the stability I provided was real, tangible. Every small bite, every sip of water, became a ritual of trust, a tiny rebellion against the fear that sought to reclaim them. The stranger did not attempt immediate confrontation that night. Instead, he circled, visible yet untouchable, like a predator marking its territory. I could feel his eyes as surely as I could feel the weight of the rifle I had leaned against the wall. Every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees, became a signal, a coded message of intent. The children shivered when shadows passed the windows, and I held them close, silent but unyielding. Over the next days, I watched him more closely, noting every pattern, every path, every possible route of approach. I taught the children the subtle cues of awareness, the way leaves shifted underfoot, the sounds of hooves or snapping branches, the change in light when someone lingered too long at the tree line. They learned to move with care, to hide if necessary, and most importantly, to trust that I would remain their shield. One afternoon, the stranger finally broke the perimeter. A horse appeared on the hilltop, its rider visible as a lean silhouette against the sun. His approach was deliberate, calculated, each step intended to send a message. I positioned myself near the cabin, the children behind, the horse acting as a buffer. I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed in the silence of the nights leading up to it, and now it had arrived. He called no name, made no demand, only circled, his eyes scanning, assessing, testing. I could see the tension in his body, the muscle memory of control and threat, and I matched it with steadiness. The children watched from behind the logs, whispers of fear and trust mingling in their small faces. I let the moment stretch, the air heavy with potential violence, knowing that the balance could tip with a single misstep. Night fell with no resolution, the stranger retreating just beyond sight, leaving only the memory of presence and the echo of intent. Inside, I tended the fire, fed the children, and allowed small gestures, hands held, blankets adjusted, murmured reassurances, to speak louder than words ever could. The weight of his approach remained, pressing against the cabin, but our small routines formed a bulwark stronger than any single moment of fear. By the end of the week, it became clear that he would not wait quietly. The threat was real, tangible, and approaching steadily. I could feel the gravity of it, the inevitability of confrontation, and yet I knew that the children's trust had grown enough that they would follow me, even in the face of danger. Their faith in the quiet rhythm of protection was our strongest weapon, and I clung to it as fiercely as I clung to them. Every night, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying fragments of his presence, reminders of the coming storm. I could not predict the outcome, could not control the world beyond the cabin walls, but I could stand here, a steady presence, a living barrier, a guardian against a past that threatened to reclaim its hold. The children slept fitfully, but closer, more secure than before. I watched over them, listening for every sound, every step, every crack of wood underfoot. The valley had become a waiting room, a place suspended between fear and safety, and I understood fully that soon, every lesson, every precaution, every small act of care would be tested. The man from the past would come, and when he did, there would be no retreat, no compromise. I breathed in the night, listening, waiting, prepared, and in the quiet moments between creaks and whispers, I felt the first real weight of what it meant to be a protector. Not just a man, not just a figure of strength, but a choice made tangible in the rhythm of each day, in the warmth of a fire, in the shared trust of two small lives that depended entirely on my resolve. The stranger's shadow loomed closer each day, but in the cabin, we had begun to build something impervious to intimidation. Routines, warmth, safety, and the fragile yet growing belief that here, for the first time, they were not alone. The morning arrived with a low sun, casting long shadows across the valley, stretching them like fingers of warning. The children stirred quietly, their small bodies rigid with anticipation, and I could feel the tension in their every movement. They had begun to understand the rhythm of danger, the language of caution, and I watched over them with the precision of someone who knew the weight of a single misstep. I stepped outside first, boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint tang of smoke from the distant town. I let the horse shift nervously in the corral, ears swiveling toward the distant tree-line. The man from the children's past was moving closer, closer than ever before, and I could see him now as a silhouette against the golden light. Lean, controlled, confident, and dangerous. I brought the children closer to the cabin, crouching low beside them. They pressed against each other, small hands gripping each other's sleeves, searching for anchor points in a world that had taught them fear as a constant companion. I could feel their breaths, shallow and quick, against my chest, and I tried to transmit through my own stillness a sense of patience, a signal that we could endure the storm together. The man approached deliberately, his horse stepping with careful, measured precision. He did not call, did not shout. His intent was clear in every deliberate motion, every slight shift in weight. He was testing the ground, testing the rhythm of our presence, trying to find weaknesses, looking for fear to exploit. I met him at the edge of the clearing, blocking the first potential path to the cabin. The children huddled behind the logs, watching, silent but fully aware. Hours passed in this delicate standoff, the air thick with anticipation. I could see the strain in the stranger's shoulders, the subtle flickers of impatience, but he held back, knowing the calculus of confrontation required careful patience. I did not move unnecessarily, letting my presence be a barrier, a living wall between danger and the fragile trust that had begun to form within the cabin walls. By afternoon, the townspeople had begun to take notice. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into speculation, and speculation into action. A woman with sharp eyes and sharper words approached the fence, leaning forward with a kind of curiosity only fear and suspicion can conjure. "A man alone with children," she called, voice quivering with judgment disguised as concern. "You must understand how it looks to the rest of us." I did not answer. My silence was deliberate, unyielding, and I returned to tending the children, letting my actions communicate what words could not. I spent the day preparing the cabin further, reinforcing windows, adjusting doors, creating hidden spaces for the children to retreat to if necessary. They observed, absorbing each act, understanding that preparation itself could become a shield, that the architecture of safety was as much a lesson as any word I could offer. Their small hands copied my movements subtly, testing the weight of tools and the balance of objects, learning how to navigate space without panic. As dusk approached, the stranger made his presence undeniable. He rode closer, his shadow long and ominous, and I could feel the tension radiating from him as clearly as from any weapon. I guided the children to the corral once more, letting the horse stand as a buffer between us, its calm eyes offering reassurance. I demonstrated the rhythm of presence, the way one can anchor themselves without yielding to panic, the subtle shift in weight, the calculated stillness that communicates control without threat. Night fell, heavy and unrelenting. The stranger circled, never approaching the cabin directly, but always close enough that his intent was clear. The children lay low, blankets drawn tight around their small forms, shadows of fear and trust intertwined. I moved quietly, tending the fire, distributing water and food, small rituals that had become acts of defiance, claiming normalcy against the encroaching threat. Each sip, each bite, reinforced the growing faith they were placing in me. Then came the first true escalation. A sharp noise at the edge of the clearing, a snapped branch, deliberate and loud, announced the stranger's move. I positioned myself near the cabin, signaling to the children to stay low, and watched as he approached, gun visible now at his hip, his horse slowing to a cautious halt. The standoff was immediate, the air thick with potential violence. I did not flinch, did not give him the satisfaction of reaction beyond measured presence. It was in these hours that the first signs of trust became tangible. The children began to imitate my posture, crouching low but steady, eyes scanning the edges of the clearing with alertness but not panic. Their understanding of strategy, of anticipation, of presence as protection, began to manifest in small, almost imperceptible ways. The stranger observed, his gaze sharp, calculating, but the lesson of patience and calculated response had already begun to take root in the small watchers behind me. By midnight, the townspeople had begun to act. The sheriff, aware of rumors and rising tension, rode cautiously toward the clearing, observing from the tree line before making his presence known. His arrival was deliberate, a measured approach that sought to establish authority without unnecessary escalation. The children, sensing the arrival of a new figure, huddled closer, small bodies seeking reassurance. I signaled subtly for them to remain calm, teaching through gestures that presence itself could communicate safety. The sheriff approached, boots crunching lightly on frost-hardened leaves, and his eyes took in the scene, the lone man standing as a barrier, two small children behind logs, and the threatening figure of the stranger who had caused so much unease. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence of observation communicate authority. When he finally did, his voice was low and measured. "What's going on here?" he asked, and I could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down. I explained, carefully, concisely, without exaggeration. The children's past, the stranger's presence, the growing whispers in town. All of it. The sheriff listened, eyes scanning, calculating, then nodded slowly. He understood the weight of responsibility, the gravity of protection, and the complexity of trust built over days of careful care. His presence alone acted as a buffer, allowing the children to relax slightly, sensing the extension of safety beyond the cabin walls. The stranger did not retreat entirely. He lingered at the edge of the clearing, glinting eyes fixed on the cabin, testing, waiting, challenging the authority of law and the physical barrier I represented. The sheriff, sensing the potential for escalation, established his presence firmly, positioning himself as an intermediary, a living reminder that while threats existed, oversight and justice remained nearby. Over the next several days, the standoff continued with subtle shifts in rhythm. The stranger tested boundaries, I reinforced them, and the children grew more adept at observing, understanding, and following cues of protection. The rhythm of daily life, feeding, tending the fire, small chores, became a framework of security, a buffer against the unpredictability that threatened to unseat them. Gradually, the children's fear began to transform. Small gestures of trust emerged, fingers brushing my arm unconsciously, whispers of observation rather than panic, small smiles when routine reassured them. They learned that presence, preparation, and calm could outweigh the terror of past threats. The sheriff's visits became more regular, each time reinforcing the boundaries, the law, and the message that the children were not alone, that they had allies beyond the walls of the cabin. Rumors in town persisted, but the visible, steady presence of law tempered suspicion, and the fragile web of trust woven inside the cabin began to extend outward. By the end of the week, the first confrontation seemed inevitable. The stranger's patience had run thin, his movements more aggressive, his horse restless, his posture coiled with intent. I prepared, not with haste or panic, but with the measured actions that had defined every day since their arrival, reinforcing positions, creating contingencies, and instilling quiet courage in the children who now mirrored my steadiness more than my fear. The cabin, the corral, the horse, and the small routines of daily life had become more than survival. They were symbols of resilience, small fortresses of trust and safety. The stranger approached again, closer than ever, and I felt the weight of responsibility press down with the force of inevitability. Yet the children, no longer paralyzed, followed my cues, their small hands clutching the familiar edges of protection I had crafted through days of deliberate care. Night fell with an almost ceremonial weight. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the cabin walls, the children huddled, and the world outside held its breath. The first direct confrontation loomed, but in the quiet, I realized that our strength had grown beyond mere physical presence. It resided in trust, in the rhythm of care, and in the deliberate, unwavering constancy that had transformed fear into fledgling security. The dawn crept over the horizon, casting pale gold across the valley. I stood at the edge of the corral, hands resting on the fence, listening. The children stirred behind me, their small bodies rigid with tension, watching every shadow, every movement of the trees beyond the clearing. The stranger had not moved closer during the night, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud waiting to break. The quiet of morning was deceptive. It carried the weight of anticipation, of violence held back only by the fragile boundary of law and will. I adjusted my stance, boots firm against the frost-hardened earth. Every step I had taken in the past week had taught me the rhythm of fear, how it bends, how it recoils. The children had begun to mirror my movements, crouching low but steady, breathing synchronized with mine, learning that calm could outweigh terror. Their eyes, wide but attentive, followed my every gesture, and I could feel their trust forming in small increments, fragile as the first buds of spring. By mid-morning, the first sign of escalation arrived. A horse's hoofbeat, deliberate and heavy, broke the fragile stillness. The stranger approached, gun holstered but visible, his eyes scanning, calculating. I signaled the children to stay low, to watch and wait. Fear had become a teacher, but trust was now their armor. Their small bodies pressed to the earth as I had taught them. The sheriff arrived shortly after, riding at a measured pace, observing from a distance before entering the clearing. His presence alone seemed to create a buffer between danger and our fragile enclave. He dismounted carefully, boots sinking into the soft soil, and gave me a subtle nod. There was understanding in that gesture, the acknowledgement of responsibility, of choice, and of the weight of protection we both bore. The stranger tested the boundary, riding a tight circle around the clearing, trying to gauge reactions, seeking weaknesses. I did not flinch. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, teaching the children the language of presence. This was not aggression for its own sake, but strategy, observation, and intimidation. The children watched, learning to mirror my stillness, to understand that the calm could hold even in the face of threat. Hours passed. The stranger probed closer, closer still, but the sheriff's presence prevented any direct engagement. I moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire, distributing food, reinforcing doors, and repairing broken boards. Each action was deliberate, teaching the children that preparedness itself was a shield. They followed silently, absorbing lessons of caution and careful planning, internalizing the rhythm of survival and protection. By afternoon, the stranger's patience had thinned. He dismounted, approaching on foot with measured steps. His gaze flicked toward the children, then to me, testing, sizing, challenging. The tension was almost tangible, thickening the air as though the wind itself carried the weight of impending conflict. I moved closer, positioning myself between him and the children. The ground underfoot felt alive with anticipation, and I could see the flicker of calculation in the sheriff's eyes. I spoke not to the stranger, but to the children, in low, calm tones. Stay low, watch, and follow my lead. Nothing happens without a signal. They pressed closer together, small hands gripping each other, eyes wide but attentive. Their trust had become tangible, a living bond that weighed as heavily as any weapon. The stranger stepped forward, voice low and menacing, words designed to provoke. I did not respond. My silence was deliberate, a wall that he could not breach without risking exposure. His patience broke in small increments, gestures becoming more aggressive, but each movement was met with measured presence and quiet authority. Hours stretched into the late afternoon. The children, now more confident in their observation, began to mimic subtle actions, shifting weight, adjusting posture, breathing in rhythm with mine. Fear had not vanished, but it had been transformed into alertness, into cautious anticipation, a tool that strengthened rather than paralyzed. As dusk approached, the stranger made his final move. He lunged, sudden and violent, testing the boundaries of our defense. I stepped forward, blocking the path, every muscle coiled and ready. The sheriff intervened simultaneously, a voice of law and authority cutting through the tension. The children froze, observing, learning, understanding that the world was filled with threats, but that calculated response and presence could protect them. The confrontation lasted minutes that felt like hours. Every gesture, every movement, was a lesson for the children. Presence over panic, observation over reaction, trust over fear. The stranger, realizing the coordinated response of law and deliberate defense, finally retreated, his intentions thwarted, his threat temporarily contained. Night fell with heavy, oppressive darkness, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The children, exhausted but alive, huddled around the fire. Their small hands reached for familiar edges of protection, and I could feel their trust solidifying, growing stronger with every act of care. Food, warmth, quiet routines. They had begun to anchor themselves in this new reality, understanding that not every hand extended toward them bore harm. The sheriff remained nearby, a quiet guardian ensuring the threat did not return in immediate form. His presence allowed the children to sleep, their breaths slow and even, the first real rest since the arrival of danger. I stayed awake, boots resting near the hearth, eyes scanning the shadows outside. The day's events had reinforced the lesson. Protection is not merely physical. It is built in presence, in preparation, in the steady, unwavering attention to vulnerability. By midnight, the stranger had disappeared into the shadows of the valley. The children slept deeper, their bodies curling naturally against each other, comforted by the routine and the trust that had begun to form. I watched, understanding that the next steps were delicate. Trust was fragile, but it was growing. Care, consistency, and patience were now as essential as the walls of the cabin or the fence of the corral. Over the following days, life resumed a tense rhythm. Supplies were fetched, chores completed, and every routine became a tool of protection and trust building. The children moved more freely, experimenting with small actions that reflected their growing confidence. Brushing the horse's mane, stacking firewood, carrying small tools. They learned through imitation and careful guidance that strength was not only measured in physical terms, but in resilience, preparation, and calm. Rumors in town persisted, but the visible presence of the sheriff tempered speculation. The children's trust in me grew incrementally, each act of care reinforcing their sense of security. Every day, the cabin became more than shelter. It became a living symbol of patience, vigilance, and trust. By the end of the week, the children's laughter returned, tentative at first, then more frequent. Small victories marked their days, a smile here, a gentle touch there, eyes meeting mine without fear. The stranger remained at a distance, testing occasionally, but never again approaching directly. The rhythm of protection, combined with the children's growing understanding of presence and response, had established a fragile equilibrium. I watched them carefully, understanding that every gesture, every routine, every moment of calm was a reinforcement of trust. Fear had been transformed into cautious anticipation, vulnerability into resilience. The cabin, the corral, the fire, and the routines were more than survival. They were lessons, living lessons, shaping young hearts and teaching them the value of measured presence, patience, and trust. The mornings had begun to change. The wind carried new sounds across the valley, whispers of townsfolk observing from a distance, voices threaded with suspicion, curiosity, and thinly veiled judgment. I could feel their gaze in the way a shadow lingers over a path, unseen yet pressing. The children sensed it too, small movements stiffening, eyes flicking toward windows, ears straining for the faintest footstep. I taught them to breathe through it, to anchor themselves in the routines we had built, to trust the presence that protected them, even when the world outside murmured threats. Each day, I observed the town from afar, horse riding with careful attention, keeping distance while gathering supplies. It became clear that every transaction, every interaction with the general store, the blacksmith, or even passing riders, carried whispers. Who does he think he is, keeping those children? No kin, no wife, why him? The words, though soft, felt sharp as splintered wood against the skin. They were judgments, and in this valley, judgment traveled faster than the wind. The children noticed these changes in the air. Their bodies tensed before each trip into town, tiny hands clutching one another as if anchoring to solid ground. I guided them with quiet reassurances, not by words of persuasion but through actions. Every careful step, every hand resting on a shoulder, every glance that acknowledged their fear yet remained calm, reinforced the unspoken promise that here, within the boundaries of our small domain, they were safe. One afternoon, as sunlight stretched golden across the corral, I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, deliberate, cautious, yet with an unmistakable weight in his stride. It was one of the townsfolk, a man neither young nor old, eyes sharp and assessing, presence heavy with intent. He did not speak immediately, merely observed, his gaze sweeping the cabin and the children as though cataloguing every detail. The children froze, small bodies pressed to the ground, but their eyes followed, watching the tension ripple through the air. I did not approach him at first. Silence was often more effective than confrontation, a shield thicker than wood or steel. My eyes met his, and in that exchange, he saw that we were not ignorant, that we understood the stakes, that our trust in one another was a barrier he could not easily breach. He lingered for a moment, shifting weight, whispering words to himself I could not catch, before turning and retreating back into the woods. Still, the air remained thick with the residue of judgment, a haze that clung to the edges of every action. Over the following days, I observed patterns in the whispers. Women at the general store would tilt their heads, voices lowering when I entered. Men leaning against fences, nodding toward the cabin, exchanging glances that carried more accusation than inquiry. The children, sensitive to nuance, began to reflect my own awareness, small hands gripping tools tighter, feet treading carefully on uneven boards, eyes scanning for unseen threats. I realized that protection was not merely physical. It was psychological, an invisible current that needed constant maintenance. I began documenting the routines in my mind, mapping out moments when the world intruded into our sanctuary, noting how the children reacted, where their fear concentrated, and how I could guide them through it. Each day became a series of lessons disguised as chores, carrying water, feeding the hens, stacking firewood. Each act a rehearsal in vigilance, teaching them that even ordinary tasks could be executed with caution, presence, and care. The stranger from the valley had not returned, but his shadow lingered. The rumor of his presence was enough to keep the children attentive, their small hearts poised between fear and trust. They began to mimic my methods unconsciously, quiet observation, careful gestures, measured breathing. Trust, once a fragile bud, was growing roots into their daily actions, and I could see it in the subtle relaxation of shoulders, the softening of hands, the tentative glances toward the horizon. Evenings brought new challenges. The wind carried voices over the hills, words that the children strained to interpret. I sat with them near the fire, distributing small portions of food, watching their eyes, noting which reactions betrayed anxiety and which indicated growing confidence. The firelight danced across the walls, illuminating faces both small and determined, teaching me that presence alone could form the foundation of safety. I spoke little, letting actions teach what words could not. A cup of water placed gently before them, bread torn with care, blankets arranged with deliberate attention, all became symbols of reliability and trust. One night, a group of townsfolk rode past the cabin, laughter interwoven with thinly veiled threats. The sound carried across the fields, but I stayed in place, letting the children hear me breathe, see me steady, feel the rhythm of calm. This became a lesson. The world would intrude, but fear could be managed, anticipation could replace panic, and trust could be fortified through consistency. The shadows may press in, but the structure of safety, both physical and emotional, could hold. As the week progressed, their confidence grew. Small achievements became milestones. One child fed the hens without hesitation, another carried a bucket of water from the creek without spilling a drop. Each task completed without fear reinforced the lesson. They could move through the world with measured caution, their trust in me an anchor against chaos. Yet the whispers persisted, reminders that even sanctuary could be challenged, that vigilance was an endless requirement. By the end of the 7th day, a strange rhythm had emerged. Dawn brought careful observation, chores executed with precision, mid-morning held cautious excursions to the corral, afternoon carried measured interactions with the outside world, and night returned to quiet reflection, the fire a witness to their growing confidence. The children began to speak softly among themselves, small words exchanged without fear, laughter slipping through cracks of tension, fragile but resilient. And still, the weight of the world lingered beyond the clearing, in the whispers of the town, in the cautious glances from strangers, in the unseen eyes that tested boundaries. But within the cabin, trust was no longer a fragile thread. It had become a growing cord, weaving a bond that could withstand intrusion, suspicion, and the inevitable tension of a world that did not always protect innocence. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when I sensed the shift. Even before the wind brought the telltale scent of leather, smoke, and hooves across the valley, my instincts warned me, something was approaching. The children stirred at my side, half awake, sensing tension even in the quiet of dawn. I did not speak immediately. There was no need. Actions, the rhythm of preparation, had long become our language. I moved toward the door, lifting the latch slowly, listening for the faintest sign of intrusion. From the tree line, I saw them, a small group of riders, dust trailing behind their hooves, faces set with purpose. At their center was the man from before, the one who had claimed ownership, carrying the shadow of a threat that seemed too large for any one of us to bear. He did not wave, did not call, did not offer civility. His presence alone sent the message. The world outside would not leave the children untouched. I guided the girls quietly, leading them behind the thick walls of the cabin, showing by gesture and placement how to remain unseen. Their small bodies pressed against my own, breathing shallow but synchronized with mine, a silent lesson in staying grounded under pressure. This was a test, and I could see it reflected in their eyes. Fear and trust colliding, creating a fragile yet enduring awareness. The riders approached, kicking up dust that swirled like a tangible wall between the valley and the cabin. I could hear fragments of words, the harsh cadence of control and ownership, but I kept the children close, letting them feel the steadiness of my frame, the unbroken rhythm of my heart. Safety was not promised by absence, only by presence, and I had learned long ago that fear could be mitigated, though never entirely erased. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, just out of reach but close enough to be threatening. The man's voice carried across the open space, cold and deliberate. "Children don't belong to strangers," he said, his tone not seeking argument but asserting a claim. I stood my ground, shadowed by the rising sun, body immovable, eyes fixed on the figure that threatened what we had built. For the children, this moment became a new lesson in courage. One of them pressed a hand against mine, the other mirrored the gesture, small palms anchoring themselves to strength. I did not flinch. My presence was their shield, a silent affirmation that trust could survive confrontation. The man's words continued, but I had learned long ago that threats lose power when met with unshakable resolve. Over the hours that followed, I observed the pattern. The man tested boundaries, rode circles of intimidation, spoke to townsfolk who watched from porches and windows. Yet I moved through our routines with deliberate consistency. Water carried from the creek, firewood stacked, the hens fed. Each act, mundane on the surface, became a declaration. We existed, we endured, and our small world was not theirs to dictate. The children began to respond differently. Fear did not vanish, but resilience grew. They assisted in chores, their small movements purposeful, their eyes reflecting a careful assessment of danger and a measured trust in my guidance. They began to internalize the rhythm. Presence could protect, routine could shield, and the bond we shared was a wall stronger than any spoken threat. The town itself became a secondary stage in our lives. Whispers intensified, men lingered at store doors, women leaned into conversations that carried the weight of judgment and insinuation. Yet within the cabin, we found a fragile equilibrium. Even as the outside world pressed in, the interior space became a sanctuary where lessons of trust and protection could be absorbed, where the children learned that vigilance did not preclude comfort, and that fear could coexist with hope when guided by steady hands. Days turned into a tense routine. The man's presence became predictable, an intrusion measured in the rhythms of patrols and observation. We adapted, anticipating his movements without yielding ground. The children learned to observe without reacting, to move without drawing attention, to internalize the subtle balance between caution and life. In these moments, I saw not only their growth but the reflection of my own transformation. Once a man solitary and indifferent to the judgments of others, now a guardian, a teacher, and a vessel of patience and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the man approached the cabin once more. His shadow stretched across the clearing, elongated and threatening. The girls tightened against me instinctively, but I remained calm, guiding them toward the hearth. Firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting both fear and a nascent confidence that had begun to root in their hearts. He did not speak immediately. His horse shifted beneath him, the creak of leather a faint whisper in the quiet. Then he did, his voice low but sharp. "They belong with me," he said, each word deliberate, a claim reinforced by history and the weight of the past. I watched the children, saw the subtle signs of tension, the quickening breaths, the fingers pressed together in silent anxiety. My own pulse steadied, each beat measured, knowing that resolve, not words, would determine the outcome. The standoff lingered, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the valley floor. I moved slowly, deliberately, not toward confrontation, but toward demonstration. Actions spoke louder than threats. I lifted a bucket of water and carried it across the yard, replaced a loose board, fed the chickens. Each act, ordinary yet precise, radiated calm. The children mirrored these movements subtly, learning through observation that strength need not be loud to be undeniable. Hours passed in this quiet exchange. The man's presence remained a constant, but our routines persisted. He eventually rode off, leaving behind the residue of tension, but also a revelation. Power is not always seized through force. Sometimes, endurance, patience, and consistency hold more sway than any weapon or claim. By the end of the week, a new pattern emerged. The children's laughter returned, tentative at first, breaking through the quiet like sunlight through a storm. Small acts of joy, a whispered song, a shared piece of bread, a playful chase through the corral, became symbols of resilience. They learned that while the world could be harsh, our bond and our routines provided a shield that allowed space for innocence and growth. Nightfall brought reflection. I watched the fire burn, the children curled in blankets near the warmth, their small faces illuminated by the flickering light. Shadows from the outside world pressed against the walls, but the room itself held a fragile sanctuary, a space where trust could deepen and resilience could take root. I thought of the lessons learned, vigilance paired with calm, presence paired with consistency, fear countered by patience. By dawn, I realized that this ongoing standoff was not a simple confrontation. It was a test, one that measured our endurance, our adaptability, and the strength of bonds forged under pressure. The children had grown in ways that could not be quantified, their trust not merely surviving but solidifying in the crucible of tension. And I had grown alongside them, transformed from a solitary figure into a guardian whose presence alone carried authority and reassurance. The day closed with a quiet resolve. The man had retreated, but his claims lingered, like shadows that stretch and bend in the dying light. Yet within the cabin, the small world we had created stood firm. The children slept, their breaths even, their trust growing imperceptibly but undeniably. Outside, the world remained unpredictable, but inside, patience and steadfastness had carved a sanctuary. The morning arrived with an uneasy quiet, the kind that presses against the ribs and makes every step tentative. The children had already begun their small routines, brushing the horse's mane, feeding the hens, moving with careful precision. Their movements, once hesitant and fearful, now carried a hint of purpose, a silent acknowledgement of the lessons learned in the days of tension. But the air was thick with anticipation. The threat of the man from their past had not disappeared. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the horizon. Dust swirled along the trail from the town, and my eyes caught the glint of metal and leather, unmistakable signs of approaching riders. The girls pressed behind me instinctively, but I did not flinch. We had rehearsed these moments in quiet, preparing not for panic but for patience and measured response. The man arrived with the weight of inevitability. His eyes, dark and hard, searched for signs of submission, for cracks in the fortress of our little world. He did not speak immediately, letting his presence do the work of intimidation. I held my ground, each movement deliberate, signaling calm to the children. Actions, not words, had become our strongest language. Soon, the town sheriff appeared behind him, his boots heavy against the dirt, eyes scanning with measured caution. The sheriff had arrived with authority, but also with a human understanding of the stakes. He did not rush in, did not attempt to impose a decision. He observed, waiting for the narrative to unfold before him, ready to act when the line between law and justice became clear. The man spoke first, his voice carrying over the valley. "These children belong to me. You have no claim here, and neither does he. Law or no law, they will come back with me." His words were sharp, a declaration designed to unsettle. But I remained steady, my gaze locked on the children, on the tiny figures who had grown dependent on my presence and protection. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice low, deliberate. "I've heard the claims," he said, glancing between the man and myself, then toward the cabin where the children crouched behind the warmth of blankets. "But the law does not mandate returning them to a place where harm may follow. Their safety comes first." His words, measured yet firm, gave both reassurance and weight. The man's face darkened, but the sheriff's calm authority did not waver. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the realization that threats and intimidation would not shift the truth of the children's need for safety. The girls, sensing the dynamic, clung closer, their trust in me bolstered by the presence of a figure who understood the boundaries of law and protection. Hours passed in tense observation. The man tested every possibility, circling, speaking to townsfolk, pressing for any support that might undermine the children's claim to safety. But each interaction only reinforced our position. Presence, consistency, and the support of someone with authority had created a bulwark stronger than the man's claims. Within the cabin, the rhythm of life persisted. I moved through routines with deliberate care, water drawn from the creek, firewood stacked, meals prepared. The children followed in quiet, internalizing the lessons not only of safety but of endurance. Each act of routine became a reinforcement of trust, a subtle declaration that this world, however fragile, belonged to them now. By nightfall, the man's patrols slowed, the weight of the sheriff's oversight pressing against his will. He departed at dusk, leaving only the echoes of his threats behind. The children, exhausted by the day's tension, finally allowed themselves to relax. Laughter returned in small, cautious bursts, the sound of fragile hope breaking through the shadow of fear. I watched them as they curled near the fire, the warmth illuminating their soft faces. Their eyes, once wide with terror, now held traces of confidence, reflections of resilience learned in the crucible of our shared days. The sheriff had left after ensuring their immediate protection, leaving behind the assurance that law and justice could align with compassion. The valley settled into night, shadows stretching across the cabin walls, but the children slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The routines we had built, the presence and vigilance, had created not just safety, but a nascent sense of home. Outside threats persisted, but inside, trust and love had begun to take root, steady and enduring. The dawn broke over the ranch, soft gold spilling across the fields and lighting the cabin in gentle warmth. The night's tension had faded, leaving behind a calm I had not felt in years. The children stirred slowly, rubbing their eyes, their small bodies curled together in a protective embrace. They looked at me not with fear, but with cautious trust, a fragile seed that had begun to grow into something real. I moved among them quietly, filling their cups with water and placing fresh bread on the table. They ate slowly this time, not because of fear but because they no longer had to. Their movements were unhurried, their eyes occasionally lifting to meet mine, each glance a silent acknowledgement of the bond we had forged in the shadow of danger. Outside, the valley stretched wide and free, a world that once seemed indifferent now alive with possibility. The sheriff had returned in the early morning, riding with a calm that only authority coupled with understanding could carry. He dismounted, his boots crunching softly on the dirt, and watched the children for a moment. Their faces reflected a trust he recognized, and though he said little, the nod he gave me carried more weight than words ever could. The man who had claimed them never returned. His threats had dissolved under the steady weight of law, community, and the quiet strength we had built within these walls. The valley, once a stage for fear, had become a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary, life began to unfold in small, meaningful ways. We moved through the day together, feeding the horses, sweeping the cabin, fetching water from the creek. Every motion, every shared task, was a stitch in the tapestry of our new life. The girls laughed when a hen startled them, their voices rising like birds taking flight, unburdened now by shadows of the past. And in their laughter, I felt the strange, swelling ache of a heart long closed to hope, opening fully for the first time in years. Evening came, and I built a fire on the porch, the flames dancing in the twilight. The children curled against me, one resting her head on my shoulder, the other holding my hand tightly. We did not speak much. Words felt unnecessary. Silence had become our language, a quiet testament to survival, protection, and trust. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the future. Not a solitary existence, not a life dictated by solitude, but a home filled with warmth, care, and the small, stubborn resilience of those who had been broken and were learning to mend. I thought of the stories we had endured, the nights spent listening for threats, the days teaching and protecting, and I understood that life, in its purest form, was nothing more than these fragile, steadfast connections. Night deepened, stars scattered across the sky like scattered promises. The girls slept peacefully, the weight of the past held at bay by the certainty of the present. I sat beside the fire, watching the flames flicker and bend, the smoke curling into the cool night air, and felt a quiet pride. Not pride of wealth or achievement, but the kind of pride born from keeping a promise, from choosing to stand when the world expected you to bend. And in that quiet, I understood the truth I had learned through fire and fear, through whispers and knocks, through the fragile hands of children clinging to hope. Family was not always given. Sometimes it was built, piece by piece, through patience, protection, and unwavering care. The cabin breathed with life now. The valley echoed with the soft steps of children who no longer feared shadows. And I, once a solitary figure wandering fields and fences, had found purpose, responsibility, and an unexpected home in the laughter of those I had chosen to protect. As the wind stirred the chimes on the porch, a soft ringing filling the night, I realized that fear had been replaced with trust, loneliness with connection, and the hollow spaces in our hearts with warmth. The world outside might always whisper, might always challenge, but inside these walls we had found what mattered most: safety, belonging, and the fragile, enduring light of love. The children stirred slightly in their sleep, small smiles brushing their faces. And I knew, without doubt, that whatever storms might come, we would face them together. This was no longer just survival. It was life, full and unbroken, and for the first time, the horizon seemed wide and welcoming, promising more than mere existence, promising home. He stood there, the fire crackling low, the children safe and finally at peace, knowing the world outside might still whisper, judge, and challenge. He had chosen to fight for them, to protect what no one else could. And now, as you watch their story unfold, ask yourself, if you were in his place, would you have made the same stand? Share your thoughts in the comments below, don't forget to like the video, and explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen.